So I was on the prowl for content the other day because I realized editing this next video is going to take another few months and I'm running out of money to commission Rim Hentai, and I stumbled across this game called, I forgot the name. Captive. Now, Captive isn't unusually bad or good, it's honestly just a run-of-the-mill RPG Maker horror game, but something about it really ticked me off. I haven't played any RPG Maker games in a while, so I went into Captive expecting it to be, you know, an actual polished Steam game, but that isn't what I got. What I got was the same RPG Maker horror game plot I've seen so many times before. You're stuck in a house and need to escape, only for there to be an OMG twist ending! Tons of symbolism, not much dialogue, puzzle gameplay, you know how it goes.
Like and subscribe!
What pissed me off the most is that I don't think it's entirely the developer's fault the game came across so weak. The idea isn't a bad one, the twist-ending witch's house thing is still a cool concept, I've just seen it done better before. Nothing done in this game was better than any other RPG Maker horror game I've played before, and this led me to confront a thought I've put off on confronting. Can an incredibly interesting concept eventually get stale? The obvious answer to this is yes, but I've never really thought about it in depth before. When the witch's house came out, its story structure and just general concept was very unique. I'm pretty sure it actually started the RPG Maker horror craze, but as more developers have played, loved, and then borrowed from it, its unique ideas have gotten stale. A good comparison is the isekai genre in anime. A lot of modern isekai are harem collector simulators filled with tropes and other escapist garbage that more or less just copy the ideas of their predecessors in a much less creative way. This isn't to say my degenerate self really disliked epic smartphone isekai, there were way too many boobies for me to hate it, but it was definitely a waste of time and the epitome of the word meh. However, Mushoku Tensei, which is considered to be the godfather of isekai, is still incredibly fresh and enjoyable despite having every single cliché in it since it's the one that created them. Actually, that statement is factually inaccurate. While Mushoku Tensei wasn't the first to use something like Truck-kun wasn't wildly popular at the time, so Mushoku Tensei's use of it wasn't just because it was a cliché. The author used and popularized now clichés like Truck-kun by initially using them in his story because he believed they would be a genuinely good addition. He took care to implement these story beats right, so they made sense to and furthered his story. He didn't just lazily slap them in because people would give it a pass as a cliché. Similarly, that's why The Witch's House is still so good today, while those that followed it are less than stellar. Using clichés because they're easy and familiar is very different from creating new clichés to be unique. Anyways, I was just wondering why this seemed like such a prevalent issue specifically for RPG Maker, and wondering about that in video form seemed like easy content, so... A lot of RPG Maker games like to copy or pay homage to other successful RPG Maker games without it always making a ton of sense. Like, and it's possible I just didn't get it, but this whole Yumaniki-inspired segment in Omori felt really out of place, and even hampered my enjoyment of the game at some points when I didn't know how to progress. Why do RPG Maker games conform to or include certain clichés so often that people in the community can make a bingo sheet about it? You could say that since the engine has starting art most people use, it leads to conformity, and maybe that's a part of it, but I just can't really see this being the main issue. Even with the same art as others, people have the capacity to be creative. I do have a couple of other theories though. One is that since the engine is used primarily by a lot of inexperienced indie devs, those devs just copy ideas they really like but want to modify a little bit. An inexperienced dev who's never written a story before is going to turn to clichés because clichés are what's easy, they're what we're familiar with and what's easiest for us to write about. Another idea is this thing called the RPG Maker bubble, where developers mainly share their project with other RPG Maker developers and get an endless loop of self-jerking off feedback where multiple inexperienced RPG Maker devs share multiple inexperienced tips with each other. Anyways, the whole point I wanted to make is that this cycle of inexperience has led to essentially an inbreeding of ideas where uniqueness has gone to die. RPG Maker is an engine both where experienced developers can push its limits to create some insane shit, and where inexperienced developers can go to make the stories of their dreams a reality in a way much less creative than they think. This is why you have games like Omori mixed with games like Captive. Despite what people think, they aren't a prodigy who's going to write the greatest story ever. Everyone thinks like that. You need experience, you need to research, and you need a bit of skill before you can do that. This gap in skill level isn't necessarily a bad thing. RPG Maker being an approachable engine is very important and gets ordinary people with a passion for stories into the game development scene. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying here. I'm not telling you to not use RPG Maker just because your first few games will be bad. That's how it is in every engine. RPG Maker is an easy, user-friendly way to get into game development, and if you want to make a game with it, I completely support you, but there's a different side effect of that ease of access I want to address today. The only problem is when the inexperienced people put their unremarkable games on Steam. This leads to an overflowing amount of mediocrity being very easily accessible, and is what leaves RPG Maker nuts like me incredibly depressed. People who aren't too far into the RPG Maker scene aren't going to notice the large amount of shit because only the good stuff reaches their eyes, but people like me really do notice that overflow of meh, and it just makes me really sad. What I'm saying technically does apply to any game development engine, but since RPG Maker is the only engine I know of with its own tag on Steam, yeah. Bottom line, if it's your first game, don't put it on Steam. If it's your second game, don't put it on Steam. If it's your third game, then you better show it to people outside of the RPG Maker community and research until you distance your ideas as far away from the recycled commentary in this community as possible. And, even then, still maybe don't put it on Steam. For some reason, the semi-closed feedback loop of RPG Maker seems to only really be a problem with RPG Maker, but then again, I guess I'm not super into the other engines' communities. Being aware of this feedback loop is really important, though. It's what leads people to creating first-person shooters in RPG Maker and getting praised for it, when realistically anyone outside of the engine would see that game as the laggy garbage fest that it is. My biggest regret on this channel is releasing these two videos. Since I'm a soulless YouTube view farmer, I'm gonna leave them up, but I really do regret presenting 3D RPG Maker as a good idea. I was approached a bit after I made those videos to make a tutorial series on making a first-person shooter in RPG Maker, and I'm forever glad that I turned it down. While videos like that are easy views, and people in the RPG Maker community will praise me for making them, supporting those ventures is something I see as very scummy. It feels like I'm misleading people, hyping them up to be able to easily make the cool FPS of their dreams, only for it to 99% of the time have shitty controls or be so laggy that nobody outside of the RPG Maker community would think it's an accomplishment. Hey, if you want to make an FPS in RPG Maker just to see if you can, go for it, but I feel like my channel is more about looking at the bigger picture, and in the bigger picture, 3D RPG Maker games are an absolute laughingstock. This engine wasn't made to do 3D, and while you can push its limits to do 3D, I have yet to see it turn out good. I understand why people want to make games like this. When I was 9 and getting into RPG Maker, I didn't want to make RPGs, I wanted to make Halo, but that's not what RPG Maker exists for. If the engine you're working in is actively working against you, like RPG Maker works against 3D, then it's probably not the brightest idea to just buckle down and barrel through. Talk to people outside of the RPG Maker game development scene, get the opinions of normal gamers, and remember that games should be fun, not just technically impressive. To summarize, I think the problem with RPG Maker games being so mediocre is really just a lack of perspective. RPG Maker developers tend to compare their games against other RPG Maker games, instead of looking at the bigger picture. While yes, realistically your RPG Maker game will never be compared to anything but RPG Maker games, only looking to other games in the same engine severely limits your perspective. It's similar to politics. Looking at only your side and closing off other ideas is the best way to become an evangelical idiot who doesn't know what's going on. Look outside of the engine. Get outside of your head. And that's about all for this video. As a closing note, yeah, I haven't played every RPG Maker game known to man, nor am I super up to date with modern releases. If some guy comes into the comments and discredits this entire video by saying a game called Sockfucker69 exists, then so be it, I accept defeat. RPG Maker isn't really my forte anymore, I understand that, but I like to think I still at least somewhat know my stuff. And hey, I will admit, Captive did have a pretty great closing theme.